And yeah, I'm here with Catherine Price. I don't know, Kath, I can't really see you now, but well, we worked together for the last probably 3 years. I've been working with some wallabies for the past 4 years, actually doing my PhD, and I've been studying foraging behavior. But I know that we don't have much time, so I'm going to move forward with the presentation, and probably we can talk at the end. Before we even start, I guess that a good question is, why did we want to study herbivores? The main reason why herbivores are so popular nowadays is because predators have been disappearing in the last few decades from different environments, and that had created a relaxation on the top-down control over the herbivores. Of course, this means that populations are free to grow, and many times these create herbivores overpopulations that can impact on vegetation in different environments. That's going to cause ecological and economic damages that, of course, create some problems between humans and animals. So all over the years, they have been trying to find different solutions that could prevent these problems. And clearly, they try things like, for example, fencing, culling or poisoning, and repellents. Now, why are we here today is because most of the times, these different techniques, actually, they don't work as we think. So, for example, one problem with fencing is that it's pretty costly and you have to maintain it. One problem with culling, of course, is that people, they don't really like what they are doing to animals, which makes sense. And one problem with repellents is that they usually work at the beginning, but then with time, they stop working. So in order to be able to find new solutions, what we try to do is actually go back, have a look, try to understand the foraging ecology of the herbivores, and then come up with new tools. So that's what we are doing today. And if we think about foraging ecology, I think that it's important to give you an idea of what are the stages that we think the process of foraging ecology has. And we can think immediately that the first stage would be an animal trying to find the food. The second step would be, once they find the food, selecting what they are going to eat. And finally, it's the process of quitting. That means basically when the animal had enough and think that he can move to another place to find new food plants that are going to be more valuable than the ones that are not there anymore. So in ecology in general, most of the studies along many years has been focusing on this last stage. And the reason for that is that many of the different theories around foraging ecology actually put a lot of emphasis on this, because it's really interesting to try to understand how an animal can actually decide when to move to another food patch. You can imagine, I'm here, I'm eating something. How do I know that I need to move somewhere else, right? But that's a problem for us, because we are trying to find solutions to prevent animals from eating plants. And you can imagine that at this stage, the animal is already eating, and trying to force them to quit early could be pretty difficult to do. So in that scenario is when we came up with this idea of trying to look what is happening in the other two stages. So we started focusing on finding the food. That stage basically could help us to prevent animals from actually getting to the food and eliminating any kind of damage. And another stage that is basically selecting the food. Even if they are able to find them, maybe we can find a way to change their preference for the different plant, and then we can prevent them from eating the ones that we want to protect. As a first step, what we are going to do is to talk about trying to prevent the foragers from finding the food. And here I want to say just quickly that we were working together with Kath these many years. I was really lucky. She's great. And she's going to talk actually about the tools that we can implement once we understand how the finding works. In my case, what I'm doing is that first step. So what I'm going to do now is just give you a quick idea of what I did in my research to try to understand how they find the food actually. Now, it's important to mention that, of course, we are focusing today, as you were all talking about, on some wallabies. And the main reason for that is that they are not only distributed all around Eastern Australia, but also they have really abundant populations sometimes because predators have been eliminated in many of the areas. And they have been causing a lot of troubles, not only to forest and woodland, but also to many plantations. So as we were saying before, causing a lot of economic and ecological damages. Now, another interesting thing about the swamp wallaby is that it's equivalent to other animals around the world. And that's really useful when you're thinking about management tools, because you're thinking about something that maybe can work for us here, but could work for other species in other parts of the world too. Just to give you an idea of where we were working mainly, I just want to show you we were working in Ku-ring-gai Chase National Park, which is just a eucalyptus woodland, typical, and we have a nice population of some wallabies there. I have to say that after 3 years of working with these fellows down there, I can tell you they are pretty smart. They know when you're coming, they know what you're doing, and they are ready to eat whatever you set up outside in the field. So let's move now then to that first question. So we want to understand how the swamp wallabies find the food, so we can then try to find different solutions or different management tools to apply. In order to do that, let's summarize a little bit what we know about swamp wallabies. We know that they are mixed feeders, so that basically means that they can eat different stuff, like you were mentioning before. It's pretty weird that they will reject something. They live in these dense vegetation areas. That means that basically they need to move around a lot of vegetation. That is not easy to see things that are far away. And the other thing is that they are both active during day and night. I just put these pictures here so you can imagine what is, from my perspective, being outside in the field and trying to understand how these animals find their food. You can see from this picture right here on the left that basically the vegetation is pretty dense. It's pretty hard to try to guess what is behind all these first plants. And the other thing is what happens during night. So basically, sight is going to be not a good way to find whatever I want to find during night and in these areas. And that's why we started thinking, well, what else could they use? Of course, there's audition, but plants, they don't make any noise that we know about. So we needed to think about another kind of sense. And we thought about smell and olfaction. Why is smell so cool? And actually could be one of the explanation of how these animals find the food. Because basically smell is produced by a plant and it's going to stay in the environment for a long time. That increases the chances of finding that smell, and that means finding the plant. Also, the other main reason why smell is so important is because it has an attraction radius that goes farther than what the sight could see in these environments. And the last thing is that during night, smell would be as useful as is during day. Of course, different emissions may happen, but if the cue is there, they are going to find it. It doesn't matter if it's dark or not. Now, let's move just one step forward and let's see what others did before I came in with some wallabies and smell. And what I can tell you is that they already knew that swamp wallabies were able to use smell to find food patches. Food patch basically is a big area that change depending on the species that we are studying, but basically where we are going to find different food plants that the swamp wallaby could eat. Now, what they said is that not only they were able to find food patches earlier if there was a particular smell from a plant that we know they prefer, for example, Eucalyptus paniculata, but also that they increased their rate of discovery with the amount of smell. That means if I put many Eucalyptus paniculata, they were finding that early. Now, this is telling us that smell is an efficient way for these animals to move around the environment. But there's still one question to answer. As I showed you before, you can find that food patch, but finding the specific plant that you're looking for in that vegetated area, it might be difficult. So the task is not really finished until they get to the specific plant they want to eat. And our question here was then, okay, smell is important in the large scale, but what happened when we look at the fine scale? Are animals able to find the food plant within the patch because they are using a smell? And the other thing is how behavior was changing depending on the smell that we presented them with. Just as a way to show you these two ideas or these two questions that we want to answer, I had these two main hypotheses that I had in my mind. One was, well, if animals are not using a smell, clearly they will be just walking randomly probably during night trying to find the plants. And you can see that that's not really efficient. That means that, for example, some plants, the ones in green here, that are the ones that they want to eat, maybe they find one, they keep moving around, they find some plants that they don't want to eat, and they end up leaving after a while of wasting time and not actually finding all the food plants that they could eat. Now, the other hypothesis that I presented was that instead of just going random, they are still using a smell. You can imagine that they have to have like a really good nose to be able to detect plants within a food patch because there's a lot of plants producing this smell. But if they can't, that means that the efficiency is going to be great because they can actually move straight to the plants that they want to eat and then leave when they don't find anything else. So how did I do to try to answer these questions? Well, the first thing that we need to understand is how I collected the data. So I want to see animals moving in a footpath. I want to see their behaviors. Now, usually when tracking movement, people use GPS collars or VHF collars. Problem with that is that they are mainly taking movement at the large scale. That means, yeah, I can improve the scale, probably reduce it, but the error is still many meters, and I'm still not seeing what the animals are actually doing in the footpath. So I had to come up with another alternative. And for that, we collaborated with people from CSIRO who helped us to build this incredible thermal camera, which actually gave us the opportunity not only to record 20 hours of continuous video, which created a lot of data, but also the fact that it was detecting animals moving as far as 20 meters away. That means that we could clearly see animals within the patch and trying to find out what they were doing. Now, we know how to get the data, but what we did to try to see if animals were using a smell or not? Well, we basically recorded the foot patch of a particular patch without touching it at the beginning. That means we had some food plants there that were preferred by some wallabies and some others that they were not eating. We recorded what the wallabies were doing, and then what we did is, after a few days, we add an apple. Why an apple? Well, we discovered that they love apple. An apple is highly palatable and novel food smell. So basically that means that if we put that there and they are using a smell, they are clearly going to be able to pick that up. So that was the idea. And if we find any difference between these two, and if we find that they go for the apple, that would tell us that they are actually using a smell, even at the fine scale, right? So what are the results? Well, before going to the results, let me just quickly, if I'm lucky and internet helps me, show you this video. Right. So this is a quick video showing the two kinds of treatments. As you can see, it's the exact same food patch, right? And the dot that you can see, the white dot that you can see here in the control and here in the apple is just showing where the apple is going to be in the case the treatment is apple. But here it's just showing nothing, right? It's just a specific point where the apple should be in the other treatment. That means this animal is perceiving all the smells, but also is perceiving the smell of the apple. This animal is perceiving all the smell except for that. I don't know if you saw what happened, but in the case of the apple, the animal was just sitting there, like waiting for something, not really eating anything. And then suddenly it decided to move all the way to where the apple is and start eating the apple. Now, in the case of this animal, he was just moving around, right? Like giving small steps, and every time eating something that he found in the spot where he stopped. That was something that surprised us, because it's not only about what we saw with the apple, but also what we saw when the apple was not there. So let's move to the results so I'm a little bit more clear about that. So this is a representation of what I was saying. So as you can see with the apple, the animals seem to be moving straight to the apple. When we don't have that, the animals seem to be moving sort of a zigzag, but clearly what we found was even more interesting than just that zigzag movement. So let's go to the results. One of the first things that we found is when we had no apple, the number of stops per meter was higher than when we have an apple there. That means that the animal was stopping many times in the path. When we look at how straight the movement was, clearly, as the image is showing, with the apple is straighter than when you don't have that. Now, the last thing that is going to clarify what we found out is that we found that the animals were spending more time with the head down when the apple was not present than when it was. That means, and when you look at the video again, you could understand it, that the animal was given a step and eating. So it's not only that they were using the smell of the apple to find it, but they were actually, we think, using the smell from the different palatable plants in the food patch to move from one to the next one, instead of just wasting time going around. So it's not like they need a really innovative odor to find it. They could actually differentiate between the different plants. That's what at least this is showing us. Now, the last thing that I want to mention about these results is something that is pretty curious. That is, they were finding the plots with the apple earlier. Why is this important? Well, it's not only supporting what others found in the past, that they are able to use the smell to find food patches earlier, but also it's telling us that we were able to recall this area around the food patch, but probably they are able to actually pinpoint that from farther away, which is an incredible skill in this animal. And it's explaining a little bit of how these animals are able to go to your backyard and actually eat what you don't want them to eat. Now, that's a brief summary of what I did as a first step to then come to this point where Kath was able to start thinking about, well, how do we use this knowledge to actually create methods to prevent wallabies from eating the food. Anyway, I move to Kath now, and then I come back later on to finish with the talk.
Thanks, Gabriel. So I'm going to now try and share my screen. And okay. Okay. Is everyone seeing the presentation?
Yep, that's fine, Catherine.
Perfect. Okay. Sorry, I should be better at this by now. But anyway, so thanks so much, Gabriel. We're kind of tag teaming with this presentation, but basically, without Gabriel's research and some other research from our colleagues, we wouldn't have understood how wallabies are finding plants. And if we don't know how, a forager is finding their food, it's really difficult to work out how we might be able to hide them. So I'm now going to sort of take a little step back and hopefully not repeat too much of what Gabriel said, but I'll go through a little bit faster. But I just wanted to, flag a bit about why we might need to hide plants from wallabies. Obviously, there's wallabies coming into people's gardens, and I get them in my garden too. And actually, if we've got time at the end of the meeting, I'd love to hear what species they're eating and what they're not, because that's really informative for us. But I guess we were thinking not so much about wallabies in gardens, but about more the bigger picture sort of conservation issues and why we might need to try and reduce the browsing that a native herbivore is actually doing. And one thing that you guys are probably all aware of is that around national parks, particularly around Sydney and up and down the east coast, there seems to have been an increase in abundance of wallabies in many of the areas. And it hasn't really been teased apart exactly why, but the suggestion is that we've been quite effective with the broad-scale fox control that's been sort of undertaken fairly rigorously for about the last 20 years or so. So there's probably been a reduction in predation pressure on wallabies in some of these areas. There's not dingoes wandering around like there would have been at one stage, and obviously hunting that would have occurred pre-European colonisation isn't happening either. So probably over the last 20 years or so, wallabies seem to now be seen quite regularly in areas that they weren't before. Where I live I'm in Ku-ring-gai, and I grew up near here and certainly never had even heard of swamp wallabies, and now I get them in my backyard. So anecdotally at least, they seem to have been increasing. And as Gabriel mentioned, swamp wallabies are selective browsers, so they choose what they want to eat, and this is partly about balancing their nutritional requirements because they're herbivores, so they're not getting a huge amount of nutrients from any one plant, and they're also trying to limit the plant toxins that are in those plants. So they're choosing those plants that are nutritious and have less of those secondary metabolites that cause them sort of a bit of digestive distress. And what this means is that those species that the wallabies particularly like can be suppressed in areas where there are abundant wallaby populations. Now, although in Australia we haven't really kind of teased it out in lots of big studies, it does accord with some bigger studies that have come out of North America and Europe, where they show that there is a loss of these like highly palatable species in areas, for example, where deer abundance is really high. And so that's probably something similar is going on in these areas in southeastern Australia. This is a graph that just kind of shows it. It's from a landscape scale study that was done down on the south coast near the Southeast National Park, and it just shows that in areas that were fenced, this particular species, Cassenia longifolia, which wallabies really like, there were still quite big bushes, but in the unfenced areas that were open to macropods, so it was swamp wallabies, I think there were also some redneck wallabies as well, that particular species, there was hardly any plants, and the plants that were there were very small. So you kind of get this really strong effect of wallaby browsing on some species, but not all. What we think as well is that there's an interaction with bushfire, and this really came to light after the the terrible fires of 2019, 2020. Normally what would happen after a big bushfire is you get a big recruitment event of many, many plants. And normally because of predation pressure, you wouldn't necessarily have lots of wallabies around. But in areas where there's this increased numbers and abundance of wallabies, what seems to happen is that after a fire, you might get the plants coming through, but any of those that are palatable, the wallabies just hone straight in on, and you tend to get a shift in the species that come out. So you get lots and lots of bracken and things like that, but not so many of the species that the wallabies really prefer. And a study was done in Ku-ring-gai Chase National Park in the early 2000s that followed seeds and seedlings after a big bushfire there, and just tried to quantify what factors were actually causing the seeds and seedlings to be killed. And herbivory was by far and away, you can see here, the absolutely the highest cause of mortality of seedlings, over and above drought and competition, and I think fungal infections and a whole lot of other things that they found. But it was mainly herbivores, not just swamp wallabies in this instance, but primarily swamp wallabies that were taking out the seedlings after a bushfire. So probably, some of these things obviously just happen naturally, and they're not necessarily things that we want to worry too much about. But where it does, I guess, become more of a concern is where you've got plant species that are already threatened through habitat loss, other introduced species that are disturbing them, altered fire regimes, a whole lot of other factors that have caused particular plant species to become threatened and down to very small numbers. And then on top of that, if you then, in the areas that are protected like national parks, you then have macropods such as swamp wallabies browsing on these species, it makes it really difficult for those species to recover. So that's, I guess, the area that we're thinking perhaps we can try and develop some new solutions. So some species that we've been thinking about is one of them is Zaire obcordata, which is found on rocky kind of outcliffs. So it's a bit hard to fence, although they've tried fencing it. It's endangered and it's quite aromatic. So we think that wallabies find it by its smell, and particularly after drought, it gets really hammered by wallabies. Two species that are found up in Ku-ring-gai Chase and in northern Sydney are this one, I can never pronounce it, Halarigodendron lucasi, and another one, Grevillea kalei. And Grevillea kalei was really interesting when, I'm not sure who it was, but mentioned that they don't like the large flowering grevilleas because it's actually the seed that the wallabies apparently quite like. But these two species, the role of browsing isn't really that clear, but both of them need fire, and there's concerns about if they do a burn that they'll be really vulnerable to browsing after fire. So it's sort of species like this, they're in very small numbers, patchily located, where the current methods aren't really that suitable. And Gabriel has already mentioned, so I won't go into too much detail, but basically the current management options that management agencies use are often not really appropriate for this context. So people don't want to go around shooting wallabies, particularly not, in the national parks around Sydney. Often the areas that the plants are in are movement corridors, so they're not really suitable for fencing necessarily. Parks don't want to necessarily go in and put heaps of plastic through areas, and often these plant guards aren't really that suitable anyway. And so there is a bit of thought around deterrence and repellents, and some of you might have seen various ones for sale at Bunnings. And they can work depending on the context. They're often fairly short-lived, but the problem that we find with these is that by the time an animal generally comes up and realises that there's a deterrent around the plant, it's already seen the plant, it's very close to the plant, it's hungry, it wants to eat it. And so you've got to kind of overcome that really powerful motivation for the animal just to go, bugger it, I'll give it a go anyway. So you're kind of working against the animal's natural motivation to eat. So what we're trying to develop are approaches that actually work with an animal's normal motivation to find food efficiently. So animals, and particularly herbivores, they don't get much nutrition necessarily out of each meal, so they want to make the most of each meal. And so they want to find things efficiently, and we're trying to think about how we can kind of use that to our benefit. So what I'm going to talk about tonight just quickly is the main approach that we've tested. Unfortunately, we have some other ideas, but COVID hasn't let us get as far into them as we might have liked. But perhaps in a year or so we can come back and talk about other ideas. But it's this one, it's olfactory misinformation, and it draws from some ideas around camouflage and background matching that you see kind of all over the natural world. But we think of it as a visual thing, but we've tried to switch it into the olfactory world. So what is it? Gabriel just brilliantly illustrated how an animal normally finds its food using smell. So a wallaby will come in, if there's a plant that it likes, hone in using the smell of the plant, find the plant and eat it. And the smell that comes out of the volatiles that are emitted from the leaves makes that plant really conspicuous and easy for them to find. So it's an excellent cue to use to find things. What we try and do, or what we're trying to achieve with this misinformation approach, is make that cue useless. So suddenly what we want to do is put essentially the smell of the plant throughout the environment. And all of a sudden, in theory at least, that cue becomes useless. The animal can't hone in on the plant that it's seeking, and so it gives up and just searches for something else. It's not hindered in terms of it's not being stopped necessarily. It just decides that's not worth it, I'll go for something else. So in theory, what should happen is the wallaby goes through, gets distracted by all these plant smells that aren't actually linked to a plant, and decides, well, I'm not bothering with that smell anymore. I'll search for something else that is easier to find. And that's the basic theory. It sounds crazy, and every time I describe it, I think, God, it's the most ridiculous thing ever. But we've actually shown that it works really effectively in systems where you've got predators hunting shorebirds, and we tested it in New Zealand and it increased nest predation by about 50%. So we hadn't tried it before with a herbivore plant kind of system, but that's what we've been doing. So we decided, I had a brilliant honours student, Laura, and we decided we'd do a test to see if we could protect seedlings of Eucalyptus paniculata. It's a species that we know that wallabies like. It was easy to get hold of, and it's found, at least, it has a range that encompasses northern Sydney. So we went out to the bush and we were in Kringai Chase National Park. We set up 40 of these grids that are each 40 metres by 40 metres. 20 of the grids had the misinformation treatment and 20 of them were what we call controls. So they just had the seedling on its own. In the middle of the grid, we put a seedling in a pot, and that was monitored day and night with these remote cameras that are movement sensitive and take photos and videos of the wallabies if they come into view. And then around the plant, so 20 metres around the plant at the 8 points around the edge, we put buried vials. And 3 of those points were also monitored with a camera so that we could record what the wallabies were doing around those points. In the odour treatments, we put leaves from a seedling, a separate seedling, into each vial. So in the odour treatment, you effectively had a seedling in the middle, and then around it, you had 8 vials that contained plant odour, but the wallaby couldn't eat. And then we compared what happened through time over about 2 weeks with the grids that had the odour all around the seedling to grids that had nothing, just a seedling. And what we found, we got lots of videos and photos. The wallabies were really interested in the vials and in the controls. They ate the seedling. And what we found is that basically after 2 weeks, the seedling survived about 80% better in the treatments that had the odour around them. So that was that's pretty exciting, and it wasn't necessarily what we expected. What we discovered as well is that it wasn't that the wallabies weren't visiting, they just were deciding not to eat. So we've still got a lot to sort of unpack and explore about what this actually means, but it looks like there's something about having odour around that's unrewarding and doesn't lead to food that mucks up with their ability to recognise perhaps what food is. So from here, we obviously want to try and it's not Eucalyptus paniculata that we're necessarily trying to protect, but we'd like to try and apply it to threatened plants. And for that, we need to develop artificial odours because obviously we can't put leaves of threatened plants everywhere. And that's a work in progress. We're currently working on that with Gabriel. We also need to, I guess, understand a bit more about this idea of misinformation and how it works, whether the animals are learning something or whether they're just confused, whether it actually will work over a longer time frame, because we looked at it over 2 weeks and obviously we'd need it to work for longer, and also to compare it with other techniques to make sure that it is actually more effective. But really what we're hoping to do next is work with land managers and conservation agencies. So we're hoping to hook up with partners who are interested in actually testing these approaches in the field. So I'm going to stop sharing there and pass you back to Gabriel, who's going to talk about another bit of research that he's been doing.
Yeah, sorry, Ralph. Do we have enough time? It's probably going to take just 5 to 10 minutes. Can you hear me there?
Yeah, carry on, Gabriel.
Sorry.
It's very interesting. Keep going.
Yeah, right. Thanks. I'm going to just go back to something that Kath just mentioned that I think that is really interesting. The fact that the last experiment she did, or she mentioned actually, Laura was doing that with her. They found that the animals can find the plant, but they choose not to eat it, or they think that it's not valuable enough, or whatever is happening. And that brings us to the last bit of the talk, because actually, what happens if protecting the plant from being found is not working? What happens if animals are smart enough to find it anywhere? Well, we need to find different ways to protect them then, right? And we were talking before at the very beginning that there's not only the step of finding that could be used for protecting the plants, but also selecting. And in this case, I'm going to move over that. That means that we had a lot of tools to explore. Kath just mentioned one of them when we are trying to prevent animals from finding the food. But if that doesn't work, what can we do then? And the main thing that we can do is try to change the preference. That means animals will find the food, they will be at the food patch, but we want them to eat something else and not the target plant, right? So one of the things that we came up with is a research that in the last years, it became more and more important for animals, but it appeared as the first time as something that was studied with humans. So I'm going to give you a quick example, and probably everyone is going to feel like they suffered this in the past. So what we did is we took the idea of the decoy. What is a decoy? Well, basically, I'm going to show you now, but it's something that is going to trick you into changing the preference for something into something else. So let's imagine for a second that you go to JB Hi-Fi or whatever you want, and you want to get a phone. Well, what these studies found is that, of course, people is going to have a preference. And for example, in this case, I could say, okay, the factors that I'm looking at is the price and the number of cameras in the cell phone. So what I find is that this one with 2 cameras is only $500, and I have to pay the double only to get 1 extra camera. Of course, I'm preferring one, and I'm just going with the cheapest one because 1 camera more. What could change, right? Now, the trick and the thing that these studies found is that by just adding another option, right, that is not even available, it's an option that they offer, but when you go to the shop, it's sold out, you could suddenly start preferring something else. So what happens then is people turn to prefer the one in the middle, the one that is $1,000 and 3 cameras. So this is something that different studies in economics and so on have been studying in the past in humans. And lately, as I said, some studies have been trying to see if animals suffer the same thing. I mean, if they could be affected by the presence of a different option that is not really relevant because it's not available, and then change their preference. That is called a phantom decoy. So just quickly, I know that this is complicated and I'm running over all this, but try to bear with me. Let's go back 1 second. How can we apply then these ideas to our world, to the world of the swamp wallabies? Well, as we said, we know that they browse different plants and they select the ones that they want to eat. Now, they usually find these different plants in close proximity. And how do they choose from them? We know from previous studies that they basically use 2 main factors. One is nutrition, and the other one is toxicity. That means how much signal and all the different toxic compounds are in the plant, right? So based on that, the animal is going to see these 2 plants, or he's going to pick just one. That's his preference. He goes for A. Now, if we go back to the idea of what's been done in humans, we could try to think, well, what would happen if suddenly in the same proximity, we have another alternative that is actually not available? So the animal is able to smell that is better than the other 2 options, but it's not able to get it. Is that going to change the preference at all? So that was the question that we had. And immediately you can see how useful this could be, because now that the animal is able to find the plant that we want to protect, we can actually use another tool to change their preference and move them to eat B rather than eating A, that is the target plant. So here is what I did trying to understand this. So in order to be able to do this study, I had to use diets that I prepare rather than plants, just because we wanted to actually control the 2 factors and not having anything else that could interfere. Plants have many things, so we didn't really know. So we did that. And what we did then, is we presented the animals with 2 different treatments. One in which they had only option A, and option B, right? The one in the left. And then we presented other plots that basically they had A, B, plus the control. The control, as you can see here, is a diet that is covered. So there's only a little bit on top so they can taste it if they want and attract them, but they cannot actually get it. So that's our phantom decoy. So we wanted to see whether this preference, in the case of a binary trial, was different when we had the phantom decoy. Now, what kind of things we measure? Well, it's important to understand that in decision-making and in choosing what I'm going to eat, there's 2 main stages that you can identify. The first one is clearly assessing what are the options, trying to gain the information and trying to understand what I need to pick from each of these, right? What I want and what they are offering. And the second one is clearly the outcome. When I decide go and eat something. That one in particularly, we decided to split it in different time frames and see what was happening immediately after the animal arrived to the plot, 1 minute later, and then 5 minutes later when the animal actually finished with one of the diets. And unfortunately, I had to remove the results. I had some really nice plots, but that's not published yet. So I cannot show you that, but I can explain you what I found. So the main thing is we found that when we had the control, the animals were preferring one of the diets, and they were just keeping and staying in that diet that they prefer. Now, when we add the phantom, what we found is that regardless the final preference, they were actually comparing between the diets in more visits. That means that basically the decoy was affecting clearly the assessing behavior. It means that the animal is now doubting about what he's going to eat and needs to probably either gain more information, or they just basically need to taste multiple times because he can't make his mind, or something like that is happening. So that was the main finding that we got. The second finding was not as strong, unfortunately. And it's basically that when we presented the phantom decoy, the preference that we found in this case was not clearly changing over the other diet. Now, that could be explained just because the phantom was not the right phantom decoy. That means the kind of diet that we were offering, but it was not available, it's not the right one. So even when that result was not what we expected, the fact that we found some effect on the assessing behavior is telling us there's a lot of still to do related to this. And probably if we find the right decoys, then we can start thinking about how we can change this preference and then use this as a tool to prevent animals from eating the target plant. I hope that was clear. Again, I was running through it, but we're going to have time for questions now. I just want to thank, well, first of all, to Kath, who was all the time supporting me during my PhD and helping me with all the experiments. And then Claire MacArthur Labs, also Peter Pan Labs, all the people working with us there. Laura Grant, who was the one running some of the experiments that we mentioned. Malcolm Posel, who is a chemist, who helped us with the synthesis of the different smells from plants. We can talk a little bit about that if you're interested about that. Tanya Lati, who helped us with the phantom decoys, Ashtude from CSIRO National Parks, and then Campbell and Nursery, who gave us all the plants that we were using. Well, that's all from me.
If you enjoyed this video, why not subscribe and view other great content? New videos being added all the time.